Excellent. Good morning. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Employment Hero webinar, Stay Compliant, Stay Confident, your guide to UK payroll regulations. We do have people still joining, so we will give them a few minutes to come into the room and join us, and maybe I can do a little bit of housekeeping at the start. If you do have questions, please pop them into the chat box. We will collate them all as an FAQ and send them to everybody afterwards. We really want to have a good discussion today. So we brought in some of our experts from our team who you can see on screen, and in a couple of minutes we will do some introductions. But as they kick off, I wanted to say hello to Adam, Phil and Suzanne from our UK team who are joining us today to talk about how you can be confident with compliance, because as we know, it is a pretty big headache in our space. And we want to be able to make sure that you hear from us around how we view these challenges and what we're doing to solve them. So give everybody a few minutes. You can see the numbers popping up pretty quickly. Clearly a hot topic at the moment in the UK. Okay. I think we should kick off so as not to delay everybody. I hope you're settled in, listening intently. And as an introductory to myself, I'm Kevin Fitzgerald, Managing Director of Employment Hero in the UK. I've been with the business for just over 18 months and really proud to lead our business in the UK, solving what we see as pretty big problems for SMEs across payroll compliance. With our platform, we currently serve over 300,000 SMEs globally, but in the UK we serve over 27,000 now, which is a big number of SMEs that we really want to ensure that we're the backbone of their business when it comes to payroll compliance and HR needs. So we brought in some of our experts in our team who live and breathe payroll compliance in the UK, and I'll hand over to Adam first to introduce himself, and he can pass around to the other team.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, nice to meet everyone, and nice to see everyone taking this early start to dive right into UK legislation and compliance. So I'm the payroll implementations manager here in the UK, and I head up the team that sort of looks after our outsourced and managed offering within the UK. I've been with the team now getting up to 6 months. I'm really excited for the future and where we can take compliance with sort of automation and sort of AI down the road as well. So we work very closely with both Phil and Suzanne, and I'll hand over to Suzanne now just to give a bit of an intro into herself.
Brilliant, thanks Adam. I'm Suzanne. I am the UK product manager with Employment Hero, heading to be with us for about just coming up to 6 years now, and my responsibility is looking after the payroll software, so basically trying to keep everybody compliant. And I'll kick over to Phil.
Thanks, Suzanne. Hi, everyone. I am Phil Burney. I'm the General Manager of Payroll for Employment Hero. You might notice that I don't have a British accent. I'm based in Australia, but I did spent nearly 5 years in the UK working on our payroll product and heading up the payroll team over there. And now I look after all of our payroll products, but the UK one is always one that I enjoy getting back into. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and conversation.
Thanks, team. And Phil, we're going to have to get you back over here someday for a longer stint. Yes. But a more housekeeping, a disclaimer, anything that we say today clearly is our own views, and we're here to have a discussion around payroll compliance. Like, please don't take it as legal advice or specific advice. We can't be seen to be doing that in this format. The understanding compliance, I think everybody that's here today, top of mind, something that you wake up thinking about most days, and also thinking about like what's going to happen next, like what changes are going to happen. But I thought we'd kick off with quite an open question, and to Suzanne, what is it like, and why is compliance in payroll like even more challenging now than we've seen in previous years? Could you help us understand?
Yep. That is a big question. If you look at it, I think it's just the sheer amount of legislation that employers have to keep up with, and just trying to get your head around that. And then if you look at what's coming down the track, so like new tax year, we've got new statutory neonatal pay, we've got reporting changes to Freeport investment zones, there's new RTI validation. There is so much stuff coming down that it's just the whole trying to keep up to date with all of the legislation that we've got. Thankfully, one of the things that isn't coming is in reporting of employee hours worked. That was going to be coming in on the RTI file. The amount of increased admin that would have brought in, it just would have been horrendous. But all of this stuff, and we haven't even hit budget yet, so there's still more to come. So it literally is just trying to keep yourself up to date with so much that is happening, so much that you should be doing. Yeah, it's just a big nightmare for employers.
And how do you, like in the role that you play in our business and, you know, looking at the product and solutions that we provide, how do you feel people should be keeping up with all these changes? Like, how can they actually get the help that they need with clarity?
You've got to be absolutely proactive with this sort of thing. I mean, there's various things you can do. One of the main things I would say is make sure you're a member of like one of the bodies that like keep yourself up to date with payroll. So to my mind, Chartered Institute of Payroll Professionals, if you're a member of that organization, they keep you up to date with everything coming down the track, and they also sit on a lot of the forums and stuff with the government, so they can tell you what's coming. Other things, look at key dates. Make sure you've got those in the calendar. Make sure you're looking out for any legislation that is coming down the track. Just keep yourself aware of what's going to be happening. And another good one, speak to your software provider. See what resources they have. I mean, even webinars like this, just like actively try and keep yourself up to date with everything that's happening. It's a nightmare, but it's the best way of learning.
And Adam, you speak to our clients on a daily basis. You know, you're speaking directly to the leaders of their business, payroll managers, and could you share with us, like, what are the common pitfalls that you're hearing in relation to compliance?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really interesting one of late, and some of those sort of common mistakes or pitfalls that sort of people can get lost in is definitely that ever-changing legislation, as Suzanne mentioned. I think obviously if we just touch on Brexit, which we'll probably get onto maybe in a little bit more detail later, but the actual fact that a lot of the legislation is either being rewritten or adopted from sort of what legislation we previously had that aligned with that EU legislation. So obviously keeping up to date with that and the ever-changing consultations that have happened over the recent sort of 12 to 18 months has kind of shed new light on areas like holiday pay calculations again. Obviously, again, I think we'll probably cover this on sort of, you know, the 52-week averaging and sort of new legislation this year around the 12.07% being reintroduced. I think auto enrollment is always another pitfall that people find a bit of a minefield when understanding, especially for, you know, SMEs and sort of directors that might not have the sole responsibility of payroll under their control, but they try their best to sort of stay up to date with it, and they need team members to sort of support them with it, or software providers and service providers to assist with that. Auto enrollment one comes up more often than you'd think still. You know, after the sort of minefield that it created when it was first introduced, we still come across a lot of questions around, you know, opt-outs, postponement, etc. And I think that's a real key area to focus on. And I think minimum wage is another, and I'm sure we'll probably dive into this again a lot further later on, but some misconceptions around what is potentially included in national minimum wage calculations, and also potentially what to exclude. So again, they're probably the more common ones and where we get the most questions around. But obviously when you're juggling that sometimes with queries from your team members as well, and just looping back one question as well, going on, you know, how is it that ever-changing world making compliance so difficult for new businesses potentially? the readily accessible sort of documentation on the websites now that employees will naturally Google and find answers that might be right, but also they may not be right, and they may be sort of leading sort of judgments and making sort of perceptional assumptions and then querying things around their pay. So that's probably, again, obviously since the introduction of the web, which I know is kind of a long time ago now, but it is obviously more prevalent that people are using sort of tools and resource available to search for their own personal circumstances and making sure that they're on top of their individual pay as well these days.
Yeah, that one, just on that one.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
You go.
No, I was just going to say on that one of people Googling information and checking on one thing that we've discussed a lot in the past is people will check something and the legislation will have changed, but they might be reading a blog or a page from, even 18 months ago, which doesn't feel like it's a long time ago. But if you've had 52-week averaging rule changes, if you've had, as you said, Adam, minimum wage changes, the things that they're looking at, even if it's not that old, can quickly become outdated. And I think you have to be even within payroll teams conscious of where you're getting information and making sure, as Suzanne said, you're on the with some of those industry bodies on the forums and proactively keeping up to date, because you can't just rely on a Google search and the first result that pops up to give you accurate information.
Yeah, and I was simply going to add like the role that our guests play who are joining our webinar today as payroll managers and consultants. Like, it is incredibly challenging when that scenario happens, because there is such a broad range of information out there, and interpretation is linked to the skill of obviously payroll managers and experts in the space. And it reminds me of my days as an accountant when I was qualified and knew the tax laws, but I would still be challenged left, right, and centre because somebody read a paragraph somewhere else about something that they interpreted differently. So yeah, there's a big role to play, obviously, with the people who run payroll for businesses. Bill, you've been in this space for such a long time, and you spend an enormous amount of time speaking directly to business owners, SMEs. What do you recall from like the biggest impact of non-compliance? Like, what impact is that having on SMEs?
Yeah, look, I actually think there's a couple of layers of impact. So there's obviously the impact on SMEs, and when you have an issue with non-compliance, it can be anything from you could get a fine from HMRC, right through to you can have years worth of reporting issues with HMRC where your tax NNI isn't reported correctly, and you've got potentially debts that are owing with HMRC, and anyone that's called HMRC to try and correct one of those errors, it can be very time consuming. You can spend a lot of time just chasing those things down, and SMEs just don't have the time to chase those things down. But it can have broader impacts as well on the business. It can, if you've got those big debts that are hanging over, you can have trouble with credit. You can have trouble with growing the business. And obviously there's the time and effort to rectify those situations. But one issue that comes up a lot and isn't necessarily thought about is it can also have a big impact on employees as well. So if you get a tax code incorrect and someone's tax is getting deducted either by too much or too little, and then they get a notice from HMRC that they've got to pay that back. If they're not able to receive their universal credits or their child benefit payments, those things can have a huge impact. And so, yes, there is definitely an impact on businesses, but there's also a huge impact on employees. And when you have that impact on employees, your employees will forgive you for pretty much anything. But if you don't get their pay right, if you don't get it to them accurately and on time, it has a huge impact on morale within the business. And then you create trust issues, and then people are questioning whether what they're getting is accurate, and it creates this huge flow-on effect. So, yeah, look, there's the admin of having to deal with those issues is definitely one level, but I think also the impact it has on the employees and how that has on the business is something that you really have to factor in as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think if anybody sees that their take-home pay or pay is impacted, or suddenly they get a bill from the tax authorities, there's almost like a really high level reaction, right? Like to what have you done wrong? Like why is this happening to me? And it's really like, that's when payroll specialists, managers, consultants get hit up with a ton of queries at month end, and it's really really challenging. So we got to work hard to get that right. Um, we'll move on to the next section, which is really digging in a little bit more detail into the specifics of compliance. And Adam, you spoke about 52-week averages and some of the complexities in there, but could you share like just what your understanding of the compliance challenges and like some of the rules and why are they critical for business to understand and how can we help?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think let's start with that 52-week averaging, as you mentioned. I think if I recall right, it was 2020 that we took that first change into 52-week averaging from what previously would have been a 12-week averaging. And whilst on sort of paper and in principle, 52-week averages sounds quite straightforward. You look at 52 weeks and take an average of those. There's obviously complexities to actually gaining that 52 weeks, qualifying 52 weeks in the first instance. So it's not as simple as just looking over that 52 weeks if someone's been employed, because we need to factor in, have they had a week where they might not have had pay? Has there been weeks where they've gained anything additional to their sort of normal rates, be it if they were normal salary rates, normally hourly, but have they had any overtime that needs to be considered? So actually, when you factor all these elements in of going, I might actually have to look, I think it's a 104-week period now that we cover to potentially get 52-week qualifying weeks. We then have to consider what pay elements are being calculated within that averaging element as well. And then we also need to consider actually, whilst that's a great principle now, we've got that bill, what happens when someone joins the business and they've not done 52-week averaging? What is the rules around that and the proratation setup of it? So I think the challenges then come around, if you were to do this manually, and every software built should be, obviously, it's built on the principle that you can do a process manually, but obviously the time taken to devise something to actually go through that and assess everything manually could take hours in theory. So having a real solid ground and a software that is capable to do that work for you, to take that time element out of it, but also mitigate from a manual process, is just going to be, I think, a game changing and something we're probably proud of in sort of EH. And Suzanne and Phil could probably share a little bit further on the work that goes into something when we look at actually that and building that into the software.
Yeah, I think so 52-week average, I don't know how many sessions I've had with Phil complaining about the complexity and legislation around this and how on earth we're going to get this into the software. And yet, I think something that users need to understand as well is with the likes of these changes, and specifically 52-week, and as Adam mentioned, you could have to go back 104 weeks. You've got to have that 52-week reference period. And there's different things that you have to think about. Some of those weeks will be included, some of them shouldn't be included. But from a user perspective, you do have to spend the time to make sure that that historic data is actually in the software for it to be able to have a look and provide those calculations back to you. So there is going to be like quite a big initial setup spike, but that will pay back every time you have to go and have a look at this calculation. And that's going to be every pay run pretty much.
Yeah, brilliant. Very, very, very tricky. And clearly having the right information in the right system with the capabilities is crucial for getting started, but also protecting, right? Like, and taking that headache away from, future scenarios where you have to go in and recalculate. So yes, we are very proud to have achieved that and built it in the product. Suzanne, minimum wage, like it has had some changes. What can we share with our listeners today, like around what they should be looking at to and make sure that they're really, really across it?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of changes with the minimum wage. I mean, the last one we had coming in was removal of some of the bandings. I think really you just have to look at your processes initially. So ensure you've got your employees in the correct bandings. We do know that the remit to low pay commission has changed. So they are now going to factor in the cost of living. So again, there's probably going to be a massive change coming up next tax year. And the government are talking about providing a genuine living wage. Make sure you've got your checks in place. Take the time to do an audit now and again. Just have a look through, look at your systems, look at your processes, look at your compliance. There's a lot of pitfalls. There's a lot of areas that you can fall into that you wouldn't necessarily think about that affects national minimum wage. I mean, one thing, salary sacrifice. Make sure that doesn't drop people below the minimum wage. And also, from a financial perspective or from a business financial perspective, you have got these changes coming in. Think about it from a budget perspective. This stuff is going to cost. It's going to cost. So you need to factor that in and think about how that's going to cost. Start looking at your budgets now just to try and think of what's going to be happening down the track with this.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating because that becomes not just a compliance challenge, but also cash flow and like, can we afford, to continue on this way? And the majority of our customers are SMEs, right? Like they're already under major pressure, in terms of their business, especially cash flow. So that's it. That feels like a double whammy in a lot of cases. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
definitely.
just jumping in and adding to it is going, as Suzanne mentioned, some of those complexities around what you potentially can't deduct as well from minimum wage. So, businesses that might, have all the sort of tight processes in place for, as Suzanne mentioned, making sure they're in the right tier, etc. Make sure you're monitoring when people need to be uplifted. But all of a sudden you come to be, in a particular industry and, that someone might border on that minimum wage, and then you might need to deduct something for tools off them, for example, or there might be training costs that you're trying to recoup. And at that point in time, it might not be the first thought to go, oh, should I recheck this minimum wage calculation? Because actually I might not be able to take this money off them. So they're the areas as well, those probably more sporadic or ad hoc payments or deductions that are going to take effect. Also factoring in travel at times. This is one area that can, again, have lots of complexities around what the travel's for, etc. So I'd definitely say a key area is if people do travel in businesses for either training or work purposes, make sure that, there's a clear way to track some of that. Or that obviously if you're audited ever, that you've got sort of, history of how you've done a calculation for any sort of travel potentially within that calculation as well, which isn't easy in itself to do.
Yeah, a true compliance minefield, right? Like, and clearly not something that can be done on a system, an older system, or certainly not on a system, right? Like, and we still see people actually running some of this stuff on spreadsheets. So it's time to actually get the right systems and processes in place to protect your business. Yeah. I'll put this out to the floor because it's related to holiday pay. The change in April, the 12.07% calculation methodology. What can you share a bit more on how people should perceive that and what they should be doing to ensure that is rolled out properly?
I'm going to default to Adam. He's living and breathing this stuff.
Thought that might be coming down the road. Yeah, for sure. I think this one, to be fair, this is one of those pieces of legislation that's probably spawned out of Brexit and out of looking at EU legislation, old legislation, probably a grey area in legislation that people still operated to, and then creating a process to actually formalise it. So obviously for the base of 12.07%, we won't digress too much on the details. It kicked into effect in April this year. And actually it should have also been, again, there's misconceptions around it, but it was for holiday years starting April as well. I think the best principle that I would say with this is variable paid people are probably going to be an area that you might consider this calculation for ease of transparency of the calculation. And also there's two potential options with it, and the new sort of rolled up holiday as well using that calculation. So this again was something back in the day that you saw quite often in potentially hospitality or in areas whereby they wanted to show a holiday line at the time of paying, and then when they took pay, the employee had already been paid for the apportionment of holiday. So I think for some variable paid workers, that could be a real option for employees to have a look at, making it really clear and transparent that that calculation is being done either every week, potentially if they're weekly paid, and they're seeing that holiday element sort of right away in pay. It does simplify some of that calculation, or it's a sort of there's an opportunity to feel simplified in terms of employees' knowledge of what that would be, and doing a percentile method as opposed to try and average and calculate a whole host of averages in the background seems a lot easier and transparent to sort of work with. I think the key in this is that it is just as much as a compliant and true legislation offering now than the 52-week average. And it's just for, again, probably for a business to really evaluate which method is going to work for them in sort of those variable, I'd say more the variable paid employees, and how also they're going to track that. I think there does, though, again, there is going to come down to some of our sort of SMEs whereby, you know, ultimately there again is sort of cash flow sort of elements with it. You know, if you use the rolled up option of it and you're paying it out each period, obviously that's an additional cost each period that you've got to factor into your budgeting, as opposed to sort of holding money back for when people take holiday. So they're the key differences that I see with it. I think it provides a bit more of a transparent, easier to understand for employees, and probably easier to do a system and off system operation of it. And definitely something to consider.
I think also, like, just following up what Adam's saying, ultimately it's the employer's responsibility to choose which option that they want to actually use. And I do think that, like, the rolled up holiday pay, it does kind of simplify it. What I would say is have a look and see what your software can do. And if you're looking at rolled up holiday pay, that can be something that could probably be automated as part of every pay run process. Make sure you see what you can and can't do, and yeah, see if the software can help you out with that.
I feel like, Adam, after your description there, your LinkedIn is going to be potentially pretty busy from, you know, attendees to the webinar, following up with some questions or to ask you to run through that again. But clearly again, a very tough, you know, compliance piece to navigate. Phil, you lived and breathed UK payroll and pensions when you lived here and still do. What would you say are the key aspects for businesses to stay compliant with their pension contributions?
Yeah. First of all, if you're an international business that's coming into the UK, seek some professional help, because that was one thing actually that we really struggled with. And I think the UK pension system is interesting because it's deceptively complex, and it feels like the rules they look simple on the surface, but then I think some of the things that really help from a business perspective is to make sure that you've got clear policies and procedures in place for your employees, and that you're clear on how those are implemented. Because once you start getting into things like re-enrollment and automatic enrollment, if you're not clear on how those work and clear on how that process is implemented within your business, you can get into some real headaches. The other thing is to making sure that your pension providers support the types of enrollment and re-enrollment that you need to that you're wanting to implement through your business. That was one thing that I didn't actually that I took for granted, was that every pension provider would support every type of deferral and re-enrollment, and it turns out that's not the case. And then similar to that, reporting periods for your pension providers, again, they're not always the same, and how you report for a period to a pension provider can cause headaches, depending on the pension provider that you're with. Suzanne and And the pension sync guys can tell you the horror stories that we've had to help customers unwind, where they'll come to us after paying pensions for years, and thinking that the reporting date they're using is actually the right date. And it turns out that once they start using automated software, they find out that they're either a period ahead or a period behind, which can create lots of potential issues from a reporting perspective. But yeah, the big one for me is being clear on how the enrolment and re-enrollment rules work, and then being clear on how you implement deferral periods within the business. They're the big ones, and that deferral period can really trip people up if they're not implementing that properly. That's also my experience as someone that had completely no knowledge of the pension system coming in and trying to pay pensions as well. So I've probably got a bit of a unique experience to then, and Adam might have some other practical advice. But that's some of the headaches that we ran into.
I think I'm happy to jump in as well at that point, and I think just sort of taking it on one layer further. Obviously, Phil mentioned different pension providers and qualification elements, and I think it's as a business, if pensions is an area, obviously it's can be seen as a benefit as well. So whilst you've got your auto enrollment responsibilities as an employer, and obviously compliance from a sort of legislation viewpoint, you might actually, or you might find that SMEs obviously offer benefits, and they use other pension schemes, and they might have multiple pension schemes that they're then managing within that. And I think at that point it's a crossover of understanding that at what point can a pension still be a qualifying pension under the legislation, so that someone might be still compliant in terms of their AE responsibilities if someone's on a particular scheme. But also having that one default is usually going to be the way that you have one default pension scheme that's operated for your default sort of AE responsibilities. And it's great that if your other beneficial sort of schemes, you might offer sort of loyalty schemes whereby they get to so many years service and they can potentially join another scheme, or it might be a salary sacrifice scheme, for example. It's just having that understanding that actually, do those still qualify if someone's in that? And the biggest area that I'd say that's kind of a win on is if you come to that re-enrollment stage, as Phil mentioned, and you've got someone that's potentially not in a qualifying scheme, in terms of, they might not have the right relevant level of contributions, or there might be elements of that sort of means it's disqualified, you'd have to re-enroll them into that auto-enrollment one still. Whereas if they're in a qualifying scheme, that just because it's not your default one, but everything else from a legal perspective can comply with the legislation, and you can support and use that scheme reference as part of your submission, then again, from an employee perspective and that well-being of not having to go through that laborious sort of opt-out because I'm already in one, that again can be a game changer. So I think understanding any pensions that might not be your default AE scheme, just whether it does or doesn't qualify for auto enrollment is really key as well.
Thanks, both. So helpful. Sorry, Suzanne, you jump in.
I was just going to say, quickly adding on to that, don't forget that they can change those goalposts, so the rules and regulations can change every year. So make sure you keep an eye on that as well.
I feel like that's quite the theme, right? Like it's always changing. I'll open this one up to the floor because it is a big and clearly well known change in the UK. Brexit, like we're still feeling the wave of change, and there's still more to come. How does Brexit really impact payroll compliance, and how can our listeners and the businesses they represent really be mindful to stay on top of this moving forward? And what would you highlight as a key kind of area to keep your eye on?
Yeah, go on. I'll jump straight in. Take the deep end. So as I alluded to earlier and mentioned, and sort of won't go into all the technicalities and the sort of codings and all the legislations it drives from, but ultimately what Brexit brought along was we had a lot of legislation that derived from the EU sort of system, And obviously, if you consider, you know, whilst everything's ever changing, if you're building legislation that ultimately is written and derived from that EU sort of relationship, when you come to that Brexit sort of moment happening, the key that I found was that we've now got a choice as a country. And obviously, a lot of it's determined by the government on, do we adopt those and keep those EU legislations and sort of create them, and we just take it as it completely is, rebrand it, and it's now UK, and that's the UK legislation, but it's still written off the same that we were operating. Or they had a choice to basically create new. So we look at that, we make an amalgamation, there's consultations that happen around sort of governing bodies, and sort of discussions happen around what that legislation should look like. And then again, we enforce that. Or there was also talk at the time of, do we revert back to a legislation that may have been around potentially before we even joined the EU as well, and looking actually further back and doing that analysis. I think an area around that is like that 12.07% method that I mentioned is probably a really good example to use of it. There was elements of that floating around, and some areas where it probably still wasn't legislation, and people, as Phil mentioned, probably still operated it because they found user guides around it. That's a real example of whereby we probably adopted a new sort of legislation using some of the old sort of ways of working that was there, and sort of putting a new spin on it and defining it a little bit further to then create that new UK legislation. I'd say that is the real sort of key area, and sort of in the simplistic term as I can be on it without going in the technical, it's, you know, almost all of our legislation could have been reassessed, and probably is reassessed to what we need to do going forward. There was deadlines in place, and some of those as well got pushed back and extended. So, you know, as Suzanne mentioned, you know, we're now also in a new government with new budgets coming. It wouldn't surprise me if some of that resurfaced again, to consider what was already in motion. And if it's not quite gone through yet, is there a possibility that the new government decides to change anything on that, or change their viewpoint on it?
Suzanne, Phil, anything to add on that piece?
I think also just be mindful of like any cross-border payroll that you have, because it may be a case of Northern Ireland, for example, might not be following the same procedures that same EU or are still in the EU, so still following those procedures, whereas we've opted out. And as Adam said, like a good one is that average holiday pay, that like 52-week. We've adopted the 52-week. I think the regulations are different in Northern Ireland, so just be very aware of that. Yeah, it's just it's an ongoing nightmare, but it is also back to the ongoing theme of just keeping yourself up to date, just trying to see what's out there. Yeah, rely on your software as well.
Yeah, that's where you de-risk a lot of this, isn't it? Like, you know, obviously there's an expectation on software providers to stay on top of compliance as well and build the right product to serve that. But it's a big help, you know, for businesses to take that heavy lifting out of it.
Just what? Oh, sorry, I was just going to say one other one that's a little bit of an obscure one, but definitely comes into play from a payroll perspective, because the rules differ from you know, not just from UK to the EU, but you know, more globally, is the workforces now are a lot more global, and so the rules around whether you're actually able to employ people in those countries are different, based on different rules and regulations, and even within the EU, they're not all the same. And so you might have some countries that support things like these nomad visas, other countries that support things like you know, reciprocal tax rights, and it can get complex very quickly, particularly if you've got a remote workforce, and you may not be aware that someone is you know, has decided to work for 6 months from Italy, or they're they're in Portugal, and they said they were going to go for 3 months and they ended up staying for 9 months, and those types of things can cause headaches that may not have popped up before. And it's not something that necessarily you run into every day from a payroll perspective, but it's always worth checking where are the people within your team and making sure that they're not going to run into issues by staying longer than they're supposed to. And as a company, you're not going to run into issues by having people in places where you don't know that they are or you don't think that they are.
Yeah, I can really that rings true with me. Tax residency for an individual when you move somewhere, like I've seen it over the years. Like a lot of people don't know it exists. Like they don't really understand it. Like, and then they're 6 months into a new country or 9 months in, and like they've got themselves in a real mess, which could have been planned properly at the start. And obviously there's an impact to the employer as well. Like and they can get really caught out. So yeah, anybody that's listening, like if you're thinking of moving, or anybody in your teams are thinking of moving, or you have people overseas, like there's a real big education piece. Certainly from my tax days, that was something we looked at a lot with clients. We will take a step forward and talk about technology. And obviously we're from Employment Hero. We'll try not to oversell the benefits of Employment Hero, but we are very proud, of what we're bringing to the market. And there's clearly a lot of experts in the business who understand deeply the compliance needs of the UK market. Technology, I guess the increase in the capability of the technology and the fact that it can stay up to speed with all of these regulations, out to the group, like what role does it really play in solving the compliance headache that SMEs have?
I can jump in on this one. One of the things that I constantly run into is and one of the problems that we try to solve a lot is removing manual process from a business. And anywhere where we see someone, sending a spreadsheet via email or sharing data on a Google Drive and then importing that in is an area where potentially you could create a data issue. And lots of the times we see issues with compliance. There's definitely people that are doing things wrong and not setting up the systems correctly and those types of things. But most of the time where I see compliance issues is where you've got a manual process and you're importing data from a spreadsheet or from an external system, and you create usually an unintended error, which then creates a compliance problem down the track. And so from a technology perspective, what I really like to do is think about how can we remove the manual process. And Suzanne's heard me say this 1,000 times, is we don't want to just take something that you would do offline and bring it online. We really want to bring a cloud lens or the EH way of doing things to it. So we're actually solving the problem in a way that we can actually moves the process forward. And I think a lot of compliance problems come from using technology to replace a process, but not actually, using a technology to replicate a process, but not actually replace the process. And when you do that, you don't always solve the problem. And then the other big one is, apart from removing the manual processes, is there's so many things that can be automated within modern payroll systems. So whether it's getting your tax code updates automatically, whether it's doing your pension re-enrollment automatically, whether it's or even your pension deferrals automatically or your pension payments, all of those things, they help in two ways. One, the rules are implemented uniformly across the entire business and you're able to rely on the consistency there. But two, it frees up time so that you can actually focus on where the potential problem areas are. And that's where I think technology really helps. Is it doesn't solve every problem, but it can take away a lot of those manual processes to free you up to focus on where there can be potential issues. So that's kind of the two areas that I like to think about.
I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, following on it, as Phil said, it's removing the transactional data that you have to put in, and if you can automate that process, then you've got your time freed up. You've got more time to check the output. You've got more time to check your processes. I mean, something I would say to watch with automation is it can mean different things to different people, and that includes what software does as well. I would say don't be complacent about using the automation. It's fantastic. Take the time to look at it. Take the time to look at what it does. Automate as much as you feel comfortable with, and then you can build on that, because ultimately, if you can get to the end of it where you are just solely looking at the output, all of the input, everything is done for you, that's where you want to be using payroll technology. And yeah, it gives you time to actually focus on what other areas of the business actually need sorting out. You're checking your outputs more. I mean, you're on the 100% accurate and on-time payroll. So yeah, definitely look at your processes and stuff.
Yeah, I think happy to jump in as well at that point, and looking at as Suzanne mentioned, their processes. So not just from a compliance viewpoint, this actually, but just something in general, I suppose, around an overarching sort of streamlining business operations around payroll, and not just payroll, I suppose, but every part of that journey from someone onboarding, from contracts being signed now, everything sort of can tie through to payroll. And I'll use an analogy actually that I shared with a couple of team members. I was doing a training session the other day, and I said payroll can almost sort of, the way I was viewing it, and I was doing a couple of things. One, I was looking at data and sort of data moving from that journey from the employee starting right the way through to payroll and then further beyond. But I was also looking at then using systems for it or processes in place. And bear with this analogy, but if you understand payroll as the London Underground, you've got, however many different tracks we've now got with the London Underground, and you might start on a particular track, and what you're finding is that that track might be pushing certain data along. So you might be moving data along through that journey nice and easy, and that could be a manual process. It could be through a particular software that you might have in place for sort of your onboarding. So that might just be a sole HR one. And then if you consider now that London Underground there's always a manual step for certain areas of pushing that data. You get to a particular point on that track and you realize that you need to get to a point in London that's not on that right track. So what you have to do there is you've then got that manual intervention of getting off that train. For whatever reason, you move to the other track and then you're on a new journey. And that can either be by having manual processes in place, and then you've got the connecting manual process, or it could be even with some automation that we see out there. People have different sort of recruitment systems, then they sort of, push data, or they might manually extract data out and push it into a HR, and they do the same for payroll and the same for pension. So I think, the future possibly of sort of automation and AI down the road is potentially having that encompassing all in one. And again, something that we're probably really proud of with EH is building an all-in-one platform, so that from that employee perspective, but also the employer supporting that, they're using that one system to flow that data as best they can and mitigating all of those manual interventions that Phil mentioned. So yeah, a bit of a random analogy to reference it towards the London Underground, but it worked in my session that I was saying, all those manual steps that you can add along a journey of it. Why would you want to do it? If you rewrote or redid the London Underground now, and you could get on one train and it take you to absolutely everywhere on that connected journey, how much easier would it make your experience? It'd save you time, it'd possibly save you money with zonals, etc. And that you can, if you sort of use the similarity to that with either systems or processes, how much time can you save? How much time can you sort of use that and value add in other areas of your business, or to analyze your data more? Can you automate the process so that you can dive into the data and actually do sort of the analytical side of payroll and become a bit more strategic sort of viewpoint on it?
Brilliant. I love the analogy, and from someone who's been lost on the tube a few times when I visit the UK, that really makes a lot of sense. The reality, and certainly I just wanted to make sure people, I guess, or we can emphasize our point of view. We know we've been in technology, we've been in SMEs, we've been in payroll. Technology is not the be all and end all. It is the enabler that you take control of in your role to really improve on what you can deliver for the business and add even more value than you do today. we know payroll, I guess in a lot of cases is a bit of a thankless role. You know, like you hear from your colleagues when something goes wrong. But we do obviously appreciate everything you guys do, and we think that what we're building is really to actually, I guess, power up and enable you to be even better at what you do for your business and bring great value. But for me and my background as working in SMEs and as an accountant and now at Employment Hero, technology took the stress out of the compliance piece for me in a lot of cases, like, and really gave me the clear head to look at, like, okay, what do I really need to do here, rather than what do I need to pull together to be able to start the work that's really valuable. And it's really it's really awesome to see, like, the development of payroll technology, especially in the UK. We are we are at time, and I really want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists. Like, I guess the skill and experience that you guys bring is phenomenal. We've a ton of questions come through from people, and I knew we wouldn't be able to deal with them today, so we'll summarize them all and create an FAQs for all of our attendees and send them out to everybody who attended by email. But wanted to say a huge thank you to our panelists, to our guests, and if you have any questions or you're curious about anything that we said, or especially Adam's analogy, you can get in touch with us through employmenthero.com.uk on LinkedIn, and feel free to reach out for us for, you know, a conversation around payroll compliance and what technology can do. Thank you.